Hello and welcome to your next EPQ video. I'd like you to start by looking at this particular questionnaire. You've got it in your EPQ booklets as well. And before we go on, I'd like you to pause this video and just point out what kind of problems there are with this particular questionnaire, which is for a geography class. So if you pause this video at this point, just point out some problems with this. Now, this is a terribly designed questionnaire. It's particularly bad for a number of different reasons, and we'll explain why we're looking at a questionnaire at the start of an EPQ lesson in a moment. But let's just try and focus in on why this is so bad. I think every single question is wrong in terms of how it's trying to gather some basic data for the particular report that they're creating. So first of all, in terms of that age range category, they're not spaced appropriately. There are overlapping ages as well. So, you know, if you're 11 years old, which category do you put this under? Do you circle? Do you tick? Do you check a box? Do you write next to it? Nothing's made clear at all. In terms of gender, it might be that you would perhaps prefer to have some clearer responses that people can select from. So male, female, other, prefer not to say. In terms of social class, these are indicators which people might find difficult to actually record or self-evaluate. For number 4, it doesn't identify how much how much that person's working for. So is that an annual income? Is that a weekly, daily wage? Obviously, it's going to be different to difficult to actually ascertain for a lot of people. What happens if you don't have a part-time job? Some people as well might not want to actually disclose that amount of money, and they don't know why they're being asked that particular question. In terms of going to the cinema, again, there's far too much ambiguity with this particular responses that are given. What constitutes as often or sometimes or occasionally only never really gives a definitive response. For question 6, what happens if you like none of those particular things? What happens if you like all of them? Can you tick all of them? Do you have to answer that particular question? And then finally, that question 7 is a massive question. It's an EPQ worthy question. How can you justify your answer in the small space that's provided? And the point of today is to really look into why this is such a bad questionnaire. How do you make a good questionnaire, and why this might be something that you wish to pursue for your EPQ. You don't have to, but it might be something that you wish to pursue. So what we're going to be looking at in today's lecture 5 is about how you can collect primary data for your EPQ. Now, a lot of these particular tasks I've taken from a variety of different resources, and there's some links at the very end that you can use, but hopefully what you'll be able to understand from this is what kind of ethical guidelines you need to follow if you are conducting primary research, and what is good practice, because everything that you've just seen is incredibly poor practice. We need to consider whether or not it would actually be relevant for you to do primary research as well. So we've already looked at secondary data and secondary research and where you can go about finding little bits of information. We'll talk a little bit more about secondary data and how we can evaluate it in the next lecture, but primary data is the information which is observed or collected from first-hand experience. So people are collating it themselves and then using that to inform their overall judgments and evaluations. Now, that's what we're going to be focusing on today, but it's really important to note that you do not need to have primary data. Everyone needs to have secondary data, but a fantastic EPQ doesn't necessarily need to have primary data. It depends on the question that you are asking. So if at the end of this you've got your question and you think that primary data is accessible for you, it's something that you need to have, then just drop me a line and hopefully we'll be able to decide whether or not it is relevant and what kind of processes you'll be using for that. If you're doing this in year 11 and you're waiting until the autumn term, it might be a good idea to just wait because this is something that's usually done badly, but if it's done well, it can do a lot of good things for your overall marks. So as I've already said, we don't need to have primary research. If you do science, psychology or maths at A-level, or a science-based subject at A-level, you'll probably know a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, but actually if you're looking to do a scientific based degree or a mathematics based degree, or particularly psychology, then this is a taught component that will have relevance for those particular subjects at undergraduate/university level. So it might be quite useful for you to know about anyway. So as we've already seen from this starter task, questionnaires are one way in which we can collect primary data, but they're not the only way. You can use interviews, you can have scientific experiments. There's a variety of different measures, just like there is for secondary data in terms of journals and books and textbooks and videos. It's the same for primary data. But what we need to understand first is, before we actually go about trying to obtain primary data, we need to understand the ethical considerations that researchers need to consider before they actually take the data in the first place. Now, I'd like you to consider this approach by looking at a famous thesis, so something that was a university standard EPQ, but back in 1970, and it's a very, very famous case. So it's what we call a seminal work when we're looking at ethics in creating primary research. So you've got a short extract from it, which is just a bit of a blurb, and you can find out more online if you are interested. A book that was released in 1970 by Lord Humphreys was called Tea Room Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places, and it drew a lot of criticism from how Humphreys had tried to obtain this information, or had obtained this information. I'd like you to pause this video after this slide. I'd like you to read the description about the book, and I'd like you to try and create a list of all the ethical considerations he didn't take when conducting his research. I'll give you about 5 minutes or so, and what we'll do is we'll go through the answers. So if you pause the video now and have a go at that. So the main ethical violations that Lord Humphreys made are these four. He didn't get informed consent from the participants beforehand that they were taking part in a study. He deceived them in the way that he spoke to them at the start, and the way that he went back and tried to gather more information. The fact that he pretended to be somebody else, again, is an ethical violation. He didn't give the applicants a right to withdraw their information or withdraw their responses, and he didn't protect his participants from harm. Now, in the case of tea room trade, it's not something that would ever be approved by an EPQ supervisor or coordinator, but you know, to a lesser extent, it's important that you know these ethical considerations, because it could be the case that your primary research, not to the same extent, but does actually break one of these ethical considerations. If it does break one of these ethical considerations, not only does it call into question your overall EPQ, but actually you could be liable if somebody takes offence to that, or wishes to take it further. So it's really important that you get this right. And the best way of getting it right is to not just do this by yourself. Speak to the supervisor, speak to the centre coordinator, myself, and we'll help you out with it if you're looking to do primary research. So in terms of how this applies to your EPQ, what we can say is that there are two basic things that you need to do. And these have become particularly more prominent in recent years through a law called GDPR. And if you are interested more in that, then there's plenty of information online. I'm sure you can ask your parents and guardians as well, who have likely have gone through GDPR training. But if you are looking to do a professional interview, an experiment, a study, a questionnaire, you've got to do two things. One's before and one's after. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to gain informed consent, and then once the process by which the primary data is collected, you need to debrief the participant. Now, I've had plenty of times where I've tried to collect primary data and I necessarily haven't done these particular things. It's important that you do, because this is an academic piece of work, so it will be something that we'll be looking at. So in terms of gaining informed consent, what you need to do at the very start is you need to explain to the person the rationale behind the study. So what you are aiming to achieve, what you are looking at, what you are trying to find out. You need to explain why they have been selected. You need to give them information about their right to withdraw, so the fact that they can at any point take away their information that they've given, and that they have the right to do that. That they have information about what they're required to do, so which questions are a requirement, which ones are not. And you need to also give them details of how their data will be stored anonymously and confidentially if it's the case that it needs to be stored anonymously. In the vast majority of cases for primary data, they do need to be done anonymously and confidentially. Things like interviews, if you're interviewing someone in a position, obviously you can say, give a bit of background and context to them, but they don't need to be named. In terms of collecting primary data as a journalist and interviewing perhaps celebrity figures, then obviously it wouldn't be anonymous and it wouldn't be confidential. At the very end of the primary research collection process, you need to debrief the participant. So that should include a thank you. Secondly, how the findings will be used again. Confirm again that the results will be confidential and anonymous if it's applicable, and in the vast majority of cases it will be. Remind them of their right to withdraw their submissions and details of how they can contact you if they've got any questions or problems or queries. That's pretty straightforward. Once you've just got those basic premises, it won't take you long to set that up at the start and at the end of the primary data collection process. Now, in terms of how you can conduct your primary research, in your booklets I've given you a number of different methods that you could potentially use. You could use structured interviews or unstructured interviews, you could use case studies, and you could use quantitative and qualitative data questionnaires. Now, you can also do a combination of qualitative and quantitative, but what I want you to do is I want you to read through the short bits of information that I've given, which are on questionnaires, case studies and interviews, and I'd like you to fill out that table that's been provided for you, just so that you've got a bit of an idea about how this all works. In terms of questionnaires as well, if you're an OSH student, what you can do is you can use Microsoft Forms, which is very much like SurveyMonkey, and Microsoft Forms is stored confidentially to your particular account. So that might be something that you do wish to use. And that's really it today. It's a very short lecture because this isn't necessarily something that everyone will need to do. If you do need to use primary data, the most important thing is that you contact us first and that you look at these two useful links. The top one is particularly useful if you're looking to do a scientific-based EPQ, and the second one gives you some more details about ethics and code of conduct. So I would recommend having a look at them. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll send another video next Monday.